Hello everyone, and welcome to this video where we're taking a look at performance and what you can expect from Stormworks if you have a medium range computer, what sort of settings you'll want to set it to, and where the game will really sort of not work properly as well as where it will. So follow along. If we look at the game requirements, you'll see that your minimum requirement for Windows is an i5 or an AMD Ryzen 3 with 4 gigabytes of RAM, Intel graphics, so very low-end graphics, 1 gigabyte of space, so nothing there. If we look at the recommended, it's a Core i7 6700 or a Ryzen 7, 8 gigabytes of RAM, a graphics card that's dedicated to this. Here they're using a 750 Ti or a AMD RX 550, and again 1 gigabyte of space. They are going to only support Windows 10 later on because of Steam. Now that's for Windows. For Mac, we have the minimum as an i5, again with a dedicated graphics card. So that's the minimum now. And then a recommended is an i7 and a AMD Radeon R9. So I'm not very familiar with Mac, but as far as Windows is concerned, the low end or the minimum isn't very high. Like an Intel graphics card, 550 GeForce, so not very high, but you'll see that the minimum requirements isn't exactly the real minimum requirements, let's say. The minimum requirements are more so like starting the game, playing very basic, but you can't actually get into the more advanced building, and I'll explain what that means. But in this video, we're taking a look at having a medium range computer. So by medium range, I mean something like this. So my current computer setup, a Ryzen 5 1600, 12 threads, 3.2 gigahertz. I am using a 3060 Ti graphics card with 8 gigabytes of RAM. I do have 16 gigs of RAM on this computer and Windows 10. Now, the graphics card that I currently am running is certainly better than my processor. And in fact, my processor is big time the bottleneck with this setup. And what I mean by that is I was previously running a 1660 Ti, and even before that, a 1060 Ti. And I've not noticed a huge gain in performance with the new graphics card, unfortunately. So what it is my processor is definitely bottlenecking my system, and as well 16 gigabytes of RAM. I'd like to have 32, so I'm gonna actually be upgrading this computer very soon here, and I'll make a new video for a high-end setup. But this is what I consider a medium range setup, especially if you look here at the minimum requirements is a Ryzen 3, and recommended is a Ryzen 7, so I'm right in that kind of mid-range of where it's where the processor is. Of course, my graphics card is better than this, but we're definitely bottlenecking on the processor, and we're definitely higher than the memory requirements, I guess, recommended. But it is sort of making a little bit of a difference here. What we will note is that obviously different things in the game require a different setup, but I like to build things, so I would say that what I have currently is a mid-range setup for building games, building properly in Stormworks. The results may be a little skewed because I'm running OBS 30 at this time, but I do have my FPS counter on the top corner, and you can see it's a steady 60. Now my monitor allows 75, but I'm running 60 as a max just because with OBS things tend to slow down a little bit, and you can see I'm getting little bits of bursts of lag, but really it's a steady 60 in the game. Now when I open up the builder mode, that's when things start sort of get a little bit of haywire, and as you can see, especially if you're moving around in this sort of builder mode, look at that, our frames dropped by half. So they're right now around 30 FPS, and this is a small boat, or a small ship. Not a boat, a ship, small ship. If we load something very intensive, such as my Cochrane ship, which has a ton of both a ton of bodies, big bodies, and it has a ton of, like, a lot of logic. Look at that. My FPS counter is insanely low. Now, if I zoom in here, when you're in this kind of mode, it tends to be okay. So we're at like around 40 or so. If I open up the logic, this is where it really takes a nosedive, and we're like right now at 11 and kind of staying in that region, especially for the data logic. If I spawn it in the game, that's a different story also. So you have the builder mode, and then you have the, call it gameplay mode, or the playing mode, the mission mode, whatever you want to call it. So with the ship, I'm actually right now running at 60 frames per second, but everything is slow motion. So my frames have not dropped. Like, I'm still moving the mouse around at 60 frames. What's insanely low is the whole game is like slow motion. Look at my guy. So I have noticed that when I run OBS, this happens much easier. Like, this will happen more often with this type of ship, with a more detailed ship, I mean. And I've also noticed that in the home base, it'll also be a little more laggy than if I'm in the middle of the ocean. And that just might be because there's tons of other sort of things to load. Now, inside this ship, and see, this isn't actually laggy, it's just slow motioned. Because of the crazy amount of bodies that you find here, like, you do get that slow motion, and of course lights and all this type of stuff will also make it laggier or more slow motion-y. So again, we're running at 60 frames per second, but this isn't really 60 frames per second, if that makes sense. So what are my settings and how do I actually play? What I do is, for things like this, I just take my time. I tend not to build massive creations, but I really do strive for medium-sized creations, which I also think are kind of my sweet spot. I do like medium-sized creations, and I especially like the speed and kind of the maneuverability, but I have built bigger things. You could notice here that inside this kind of square box, that the akimbo is like a fourth the size of the Cochrane. So it is a big difference in size, but much less laggier here, and much less laggier in the game when I spawn it up. So again, in the base here, it always is a little bit slower, but you can see we're not slow motion now. We're actually able to run around at almost full speed, I'd say. So you could actually kind of sprint around, and it's not like super slow. Obviously anything smaller than this will be fine, but this is sort of how the building bit I can get used to, because I almost consider this like a design game, like an engineering program, not game. So this is fine. Like, if it's laggier here, that doesn't matter. If it's laggier in game, then things get a little bit dicier. So I don't usually play with big ships like the Cochrane. I tend to stick to the Akimbo or like the Avala class. I've actually optimized quite well, even for a ship this size. I'd say this is about, not lengthwise, but tonnage-wise, probably half the tonnage of the Cochrane, with half as many things. But this is still a fairly large ship with 4 decks and all sorts of stuff, so it still is a good size to play, and when you spawn it in, it's not so bad. Anyways, I know you're all dying for me to get to these settings. So what are my settings currently at? How do I play? So you can see a little bit of slow-mo, but not too bad with this. Building even a ship this size, easy with mid-range graphics, or a mid-range computer. Playing is a little slower. There are things you can do to optimize it. So if we head over to the settings, you can see within my graphics, full screen's a must. Gotta have it in full screen. It's going to be laggy if you don't, because the process is on the computer. Resolution, I'm running at 1080. I'm not running any AA, and I have VSync on, very low distance, so actually the lowest possible distance, highest possible camera shake, that's just a personal preference, motion blur, bloom, everything else here is on medium except the monitor quality and tree quality. Now, tree quality doesn't really matter, but monitor quality, I found that if you run on medium, you're going to affect all your little displays in the game, and it's going to be a brutal experience for you, so you'll want high monitor quality. Inside the general tab here, these are also sometimes just personal settings, but some of them do play an effect on your graphics. So the clock, player names, chat messages, all this stuff, I would say is personal preference, accessibility. This here where you have the blood effects, most likely it won't really change your gaming experience as far as graphics and lag. You just kind of play. Particle effects, this here may, so I would recommend, if you have a weaker system, to turn down your particle effects. This will prevent some of those little particles and will hopefully make your game run a little bit smoother. Now this here, I highly recommend to leave it on high. If at all possible, leave it on high. Putting medium, low, or auto will potentially cause some creations to crash or not work properly, especially ones that have lots of pivots and kind of moving bodies and stuff. So even with a medium range setup, I'd say put this on high as a priority, even more than a priority in some of the visual effects. Now this here wildlife, I left it on enabled because I like the wildlife. Fish spawn rate, I put it on medium. It may help the system a little bit to have a little less fish to kind of spawn, but I've not really noticed many big differences putting high or medium on this. So it's a little bit of a personal preference, but I guess the general tab, the physics part here, is the most important for a proper sort of gameplay. Now vehicle foam, ocean reflection, those are all things that I kind of set so that I get a nice playing experience. And truthfully, my upgraded graphics card didn't actually give me any benefits really. I wouldn't say that it changed much at all, to be honest. So I would say that if you have a Ryzen 5 or like an i5 from a few generations old, your gaming experience will be quite similar. If you don't, as long as you don't have like a potato graphics card, if you have a decent graphics card, you should expect decent performance. So this is what I use, these settings. They work good for me. And again, for massive creations such as this, or larger creations such as this, you do get some lag, a little bit of lag. But I would say that with building anything smaller, especially like a truck, you will never have any problems, or a rib, or playing the game just as, you know, as a to complete the missions and stuff. You could use things like this and play all the time. Now where things get a little dicey is if you're going up to a rescue and they have a lot of fire. Now fire is one thing that's in this game that will cause a lot of lag, so be aware of that. There's not really much you can do. You may have to turn down your graphics as you get to one of those types of missions, unfortunately, but for the most part I found that you can play. Another thing that you may need to turn off, now I wish the game actually had this in the settings that you could adjust this, but one way to get rid of this smoke cloud is to actually turn on infinite fuel. So it is a bit of a glitch, and I mean, you're exploiting the game, you have unlimited fuel now, but at least you can actually play a little better if a ship is very laggy. I found, for me, loading up one of these massive ships that has a huge funnel and like 4 or 5 engines, tons of smoke, it's easier to play with infinite fuel on as much as it is exploiting the game. I know that the ship is built to work with the fuel, so I'm fine with kind of using that, but I do get a better frame rate if I have the infinite fuel on and I'm not causing the smoke. A little unrealistic, and I don't like to do that very much, but if I'm getting unplayable kind of graphics or frame rate, that slow motion effect, I have to do that, and I just do it. So that is a little kind of tip that I give to the mid-range computer folk. If you find that you are really struggling, you could kind of turn that setting and play with it. But for the most part, I'd say you'll have an enjoyable building experience. Some of it is just optimization in the game, unfortunately, and some of it is the creations. Now, the new gas update actually did sort of change, I'd say, a little bit of that as well, in a sense that I got a little bit more lag because now the game is actually processing the gases, which it previously was not, but it hasn't really affected it that much. So that is the settings and the playability for a mid-range computer. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for low-end and high-end computer settings, as well as other content and creations. And as always, happy Stormworksing, everyone. What can we come to expect of Stormworks in the next little while? Well, the developers have alluded to another game they're developing that they call Not Stormworks 2, meaning Stormworks will still continue to be supported and developed. They also said they have a DLC coming, as well as a bunch of little updates as well.